My name is Ella Woods, and I was 28 the day my family decided my wedding was a punchline. I was standing at the altar in a glass conservatory in Pennsylvania. The silk of my dress pulled heavy against the floorboards. The officiant paused to ask for the rings. It is the exact moment you are supposed to look into your partner's eyes and let the rest of the world blur out. Instead, my gaze drifted past Julian's shoulder. The venue was designed exactly the way I structure my digital canvases. I have a strict rule against pitch-black backgrounds because they drain the life out of a subject. So the space behind the altar was vibrant, rich cinematic tones, deep emerald foliage punctuated by sharp, high-contrast orchids arranged sparsely enough that the eye could rest. No visual clutter. Perfect harmony. And right in the center of that harmony, in the very front row, sat 2 empty chairs. Pristine, white, reserved placards rested on the velvet cushions. My parents, Diane and Richard, were not there. My older sister, Olivia, was not sitting beside them. 2 hours earlier, while the makeup artist was pinning my hair, my phone vibrated against the marble vanity in the bridal suite. It was a group text from my mother. Not a wish for a beautiful day, not an apology. It was a photograph. Olivia was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a champagne flute, lounging on the teak deck of a yacht in Miami. The caption, typed in my mother's predictable syntax, read, "Family first, enjoying the sun with my girls." They skipped my wedding for a boat rental. They called my invitations a joke and mailed them back to me. Welcome back to Pana Vengeance, where we tell the stories of people who face impossible families and answer with quiet strength instead of noise. Tell me your age in the comments and let me know if you have ever stood at the edge of a major milestone and realized the people who share your blood went out of their way to look in the other direction. If you know what that particular silence sounds like, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. Because this story starts at an empty altar and ends with a text message I will never let my mother forget. Here is what my parents, sitting on that rented boat 1,000 miles away, did not know. They thought I was standing at the altar with a struggling freelance coder. They thought Julian was a guy who built back-end databases out of a cramped apartment. They believed this because I let them believe it. They had no idea that Julian Sterling was the founder and CEO of Sterling Tech. They did not know the quiet man putting a gold band on my finger was worth $5 billion. I pulled my eyes away from the empty chairs and looked back at my soon-to-be husband. He caught my gaze, reading the subtle shift in my posture, and gave my hand a brief, grounding squeeze. We said our vows. We walked down the aisle to the flash of private cameras. To understand how my family ended up on a yacht while I married a tech billionaire in secret, and why their frantic messages a few days later were met with nothing but a single laughing emoji, you have to understand how they built me into an afterthought. It did not start with a missed flight. It started long before that, in a house where my sister was the investment and I was the cost. Growing up, my parents made the dividing line very clear. Olivia was loud, demanding, and built for the kind of attention my mother craved. I was quiet, observant, and preferred the glow of a monitor to the stage of a pageant. While Olivia received expensive dresses and catered birthday parties, I was handed down obsolete electronics. My parents viewed my passion for digital graphic design as a cute little hobby. They dismissed my talent entirely. I spent hours in my room building assets in razor-sharp, high definition. I learned early on how to remove excess dry branches and visual clutter from my designs to ensure perfect, breathable harmony. I controlled my digital world because I had zero control over the real one. The defining moment happened the week I graduated high school. Olivia received a brand new car for her graduation 2 years prior. My parents handed me a $50 gift card to an art supply store. They handed it to me in the kitchen right before leaving to take Olivia shopping for a vacation wardrobe. I just looked at the plastic card on the counter. I did not yell. I did not ask why. I just learned to expect nothing. But expectations are funny things. When you stop waiting for your family to validate you, your hands are free to build something that actually matters. The house I grew up in sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Pennsylvania, a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a wraparound porch. To the neighbors, we were a picture of suburban stability. Inside, the architecture of our family was drawn with a sharp, unforgiving line. On one side stood Olivia. On the other side was the space I occupied. Olivia was born to be looked at, and my mother Diane was born to be her audience. The hallway staircase served as a gallery dedicated entirely to my sister. Framed photographs lined the wall from the baseboards to the ceiling. Olivia in a sequined pageant dress at age 7. Olivia holding a cheerleading trophy at 14. Olivia at prom draped in silk, smiling a practiced, effortless smile. If you walked up those stairs, you would assume I did not exist. I was not in the photos. I was the person holding the reflector board out of frame or sitting in the back seat of the car guarding her garment bags. Our household ran on a very specific currency, and that currency was attention. Olivia demanded it, my mother supplied it, and my father, Richard, funded it, without question. The contrast between us was not just in how we were treated, but in what we were handed. When Olivia needed a laptop for high school, she received a sleek, top-of-the-line model unboxed on the kitchen island. When I needed one 2 years later, I was given her discarded machine. The battery held a charge for 10 minutes. The screen flickered if you tilted it past a certain angle. But that broken, hand-me-down computer became my sanctuary. While my mother and sister spent their evenings downstairs discussing fabric swatches and guest lists for whatever social event Olivia was anchoring that month, I retreated to my room. I taught myself digital graphic design. I found something in the glow of that monitor that the real world refused to give me. I found control. In a digital workspace, the rules made sense. If you write the script correctly, the program obeys. I developed an obsession with technical precision. I spent hours building custom assets, refusing to work in anything less than razor-sharp 1080p resolution. I favored a 16:9 aspect ratio, treating every blank canvas like a cinematic frame waiting to be filled. My aesthetic gravitated toward the dramatic. Fantasy landscapes, surreal lighting, deep, glowing elements set against rich backgrounds. I despised visual clutter. I would sit in the quiet of my bedroom, meticulously clicking my mouse, removing excess dry branches from a digital forest, or pruning stray light flares until the image achieved a perfect, breathable harmony. I controlled the density and arrangement of every element. Nothing was allowed to be out of place. Nothing was allowed to be messy. One evening, my mother walked into my room without knocking. She was holding a steaming iron and a sash from one of Olivia's dresses. I was in the middle of rendering a complex, high-contrast digital portrait. I turned the monitor slightly, a rare moment of vulnerability, hoping she might notice the intricate shadow work I had just perfected. Diane glanced at the screen for a fraction of a second. Her eyes glazed over. She called it a cute little hobby. She told me to log off and come downstairs to hold the fabric taut while she pressed the wrinkles out of Olivia's sash. A cute little hobby. She did not see the hundreds of hours of self-taught skill. She did not see the technical math required to balance the color grading. She saw an inconvenience keeping me from my actual job, which was serving as background support for my sister. I turned off the monitor. I went downstairs. I held the fabric. I learned a very cold, clear lesson that night. You do not ask people to see your value when they have already decided you have none. That dynamic crystallized the week I graduated high school. 2 years prior, Olivia's high school graduation was treated like a royal coronation. My parents hosted a catered backyard party for 50 guests. The climax of the afternoon occurred in the driveway. Richard blindfolded Olivia, guided her out the front door, and pulled off the blindfold to reveal a brand new silver sedan sitting on the asphalt with a giant red bow on the hood. Diane cried. Olivia screamed and jumped into Richard's arms. The neighbors clapped. When my turn came, there was no catered party. There was no blindfold. It was a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen counter eating cereal, dressed in my graduation gown, because the ceremony was in 2 hours. Diane walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of mail. She slid a plain white envelope across the granite countertop toward me. She did not look up from the catalog she was browsing for Olivia's upcoming sorority formal. I opened the envelope. Inside was a piece of cardboard holding a plastic gift card to a local art supply store. The amount printed in black ink in the corner read $50. I sat there, holding the plastic card. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear Diane flipping a glossy page in her catalog. I thought about the silver sedan with the leather seats. I thought about the 50 guests eating catered food in our backyard. Then I looked down at the gift card. I did not throw it back at her. I did not demand an explanation. I just slid it into my pocket and finished my cereal. I assumed that was the floor of their neglect. I was wrong. The actual betrayal arrived 2 months later, in the dead heat of August, 3 weeks before I was scheduled to leave for college. I had been accepted into a decent state university. I worked shifts at a local diner for 2 years to save enough money to cover my housing and textbooks. The baseline tuition was supposed to come from a family college fund Richard had set up when we were children. That was the established rule. Olivia used it. I was going to use it. I walked into the dining room one evening to ask Richard for the tuition check so I could meet the university's payment deadline. He was sitting at the head of the table shuffling a stack of utility bills. Diane was sitting across from him nursing a glass of white wine. When I asked for the check, the room went entirely still. Richard stopped shuffling the papers. He looked down at the mahogany table, refusing to meet my eyes. Diane set her wine glass down. The sharp clink of the crystal against the wood sounded like a gavel dropping. She used her calmest, most reasonable tone, the voice she used when explaining a minor scheduling conflict. She told me the money was gone. I stood there, the university invoice in my hand, and asked her what she meant. Diane folded her hands. She explained that Olivia had secured an internship in a major city. To capitalize on the opportunity, Olivia needed to project the right image. She needed to network with the right people. That meant she needed a lease in a luxury high-rise building, a wardrobe upgrade, and a living stipend that her entry-level internship did not cover. They had drained my college tuition fund to pay for Olivia's zip code. I looked at my father. I waited for him to interject to say it was a mistake to offer a compromise. Richard kept his eyes glued to the utility bills. He was a man who had long ago traded his spine for peace in his own house. Diane watched my face, waiting for me to scream. When I did not, she offered her justification. She said I was smart and resourceful. She said I could take out student loans, or maybe defer a year and work full-time. She actually smiled a thin, rehearsed curve of the lips and said she knew I would figure it out, because I was the independent one. She packaged their theft as a compliment. In that dining room, breathing in the smell of my mother's expensive perfume and my father's cowardice, the reality of my existence in that family locked into place. I was furniture. You do not ask a chair what its dreams are. You do not worry about a bookshelf's future. You just use them to hold up the things you actually care about. My future had been liquidated, silently and without my consent, to ensure my sister's facade remained flawless. I did not argue. Arguing requires a belief that the other person might change their mind. I just turned around and walked up the stairs to my room. I packed my clothes. I packed my hand-me-down computer. I signed the predatory student loan documents the next morning, packed my bags into a friend's car, and left for the state university without saying goodbye. I stopped trying to be in their photographs. I accepted my role as the ghost in the Woods family. I decided that if I was going to be invisible to them, I would use that invisibility to build something they could never touch. I took my obsession with perfect pixels and visual harmony, and I turned it into a weapon. I had no idea that my refusal to settle for a pitch-black background on a digital canvas was about to put me in the direct path of a man who owned the very industry I was trying to break into. By my mid-20s, I had turned my invisibility into a currency. I lived in a studio apartment with exposed pipes and a radiator that rattled all winter. But inside that cramped room sat a processing tower that cost more than my first car, and dual monitors that displayed the world in flawless high definition. I survived the gig economy by outworking everyone else. I paid my predatory student loans on time every single month without ever asking Richard or Diane for a dime. I became a ghost who could afford her own haunting. I built a reputation in the digital art space as someone who could execute complex visions without requiring hand-holding. That reputation caught the attention of a boutique tech startup operating under a strict non-disclosure agreement. The creative brief they sent over was a puzzle most graphic designers would reject out of hand due to the suffocating constraints. The client requested a dramatic fantasy-style cosmic design. The aspect ratio had to be exactly 16:9. The resolution was locked strictly at 1080. The focal elements of the canvas were a bizarre combination. They wanted a pristine lotus flower and a traditional zodiac buffalo. Attached to the email was a source reference image for the buffalo, along with a stark directive typed in bold font. The posture of the animal must match this exact file. 0 margin for error. I thrived on that kind of micromanagement. I spent 3 full days mapping the digital skeleton of the buffalo to mirror the heavy, stoic energy of the source image. I isolated the subject, pruning away any visual noise, until the posture was a pixel-perfect reflection of their demand. Then came the typography. The branding needed to read FOP2V. The specifications dictated bold, 3-dimensional red text dropping deep, heavy shadows. This text had to be anchored precisely in the center of the horizontal axis. The final instruction in the brief suggested a dark aesthetic for the background. I read that line and immediately decided to ignore it. I refused to use pitch black on a canvas. Pitch black is lazy. It swallows light and flattens depth. You cannot build a dramatic style on a dead background. Instead, I engineered a vibrant, cinematic nebula. I layered rich indigos and glowing luminescent purples, giving the 3-dimensional red text a theater to inhabit. I scrubbed the frame of every stray comet and every digital dry branch, ensuring the image achieved perfect, breathable harmony. I submitted the file on a Thursday afternoon. The reviewer demanded a video conference the very next morning. I sat at my desk, sipping stale coffee and preparing to defend my choices to a mid-level project manager with a padded ego. The screen connected. The man on the other end sat in a stark, minimalist office. There were no framed degrees on the wall behind him. There was no distracting artwork. There was no visual clutter of any kind. There was just him wearing a plain charcoal sweater. His eyes were focused on an off-screen monitor scanning my digital rendering. He introduced himself using only his first name, Julian. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He shared his screen and zoomed in on the lotus. He panned over to the zodiac buffalo. He checked the structural alignment of the red text to ensure it rested dead center on the horizontal plane. He scrutinized the shadows. Then he unmuted his microphone and looked directly into the webcam. "The posture is an exact match," he said. His voice was low and analytical. "But you ignored the color palette directive for the background. You went vibrant instead of black." I held his gaze through the lens. I did not apologize. I told him pitch black hides flaws, and I prefer to show my work. I explained that true drama requires contrast, and you cannot build contrast in the dark. A slow, genuine smile broke the serious line of his mouth. He leaned back in his chair. "You despise visual clutter," he noted. I told him I just prefer things to exist exactly where they belong. Julian was supposed to be a low-level supervisor overseeing a passion project for a shell corporation. But after that meeting, we started talking daily. The conversations shifted from rendering times and aspect ratios to architecture and design. We discussed the philosophy of removing excess from your life to find the truth underneath. He understood my desperate need for control. I understood his unyielding demand for exactness. We began dating quietly. We met for coffee in empty diners on Tuesday mornings. We walked through museums, specifically avoiding the crowded exhibits. He projected the same quiet control I cultivated in my designs. He never raised his voice. He never demanded the spotlight. It took 3 months for the shell company facade to drop. I was walking past a newsstand on my way back to the apartment when I saw a copy of a major financial magazine. The face on the cover was the man who had praised my Zodiac buffalo. The headline read, "Julian Sterling, the quiet architect of Sterling Tech." The man sipping bad diner coffee with me was worth $5 billion. I bought the magazine and dropped it on the table in front of him that night. He did not flinch. He did not offer frantic excuses. He calmly explained that he used the alias for his personal passion projects because he wanted people to judge the work and not the wealth. He wanted to know that the people he interacted with were responding to him and not his bank account. He waited for me to react. He braced himself for the normal human response to billions of dollars. But I did not feel excitement or relief. I felt a cold spike of pure terror. I was not afraid of Julian. I was terrified of my mother. I knew exactly how Diane viewed the world. People were not humans to her. They were assets to be leveraged. If Diane discovered that the daughter she treated like discarded furniture was holding a golden ticket, she would tear down my sanctuary to get her hands on it. She would suffocate Julian with her transactional greed. She would parade him around the country club and force him to fund Olivia's endless appetite for luxury. I looked at Julian across the table and made a decision. I asked him to keep his true identity hidden from my family. I told him I needed to protect the first pure thing I had ever built. Julian understood. He agreed to play the part of a struggling coder whenever my family was mentioned. To my parents, my brilliant CEO remained an underpaid freelancer typing away in a basement. It was the perfect shield. It kept my family entirely uninterested in my life. It kept us safe right up until the evening Julian handed me a ring and asked me to be his wife. Julian asked me to marry him on a Tuesday morning in my studio. There was no grand public spectacle. He did not hire a photographer to hide in the bushes. He understood my distaste for performance. He simply walked over to my desk, waited for me to save the file I was working on, and placed a small, matte charcoal box next to my keyboard. The ring inside was a masterclass in restraint. It featured a flawless emerald-cut diamond set in platinum. Clean lines, perfect geometry, no halo of crushed stones to distract from the center. It was a ring designed for someone who appreciated structure over flash. It was exactly what I wanted. I said yes. We sat by the radiator drinking coffee, mapping out a life that belonged solely to us. But the reality of an engagement meant I had to inform the people who shared my last name. I arranged a dinner for that Friday at a restaurant halfway between my apartment and my parents' house in the suburbs. Julian offered to join me. I told him to stay home. Diane required a specific type of emotional management, and introducing a fiancé into her atmosphere required a buffer. I wanted to deliver the news, gauge the temperature of the room, and leave. I arrived 15 minutes early and secured a booth in the back. Diane, Richard, and Olivia walked through the double doors right on time. Olivia slid into the booth across from me. She was dressed in a silk blouse, carrying a designer handbag that displayed its logo a fraction too large. It was the kind of bag people buy when they need strangers to know they spent money. Diane sat next to her, adjusting the cuffs of her cardigan, while Richard took the aisle seat. Noticeably absent was Olivia's husband, Bradley. Diane did not ask how my drive was. She did not ask about my design work. She immediately launched into a rehearsed monologue detailing Bradley's current business ventures. According to my mother, Bradley was conquering the commercial real estate market one zip code at a time. She spoke of his pending acquisitions with a breathless reverence. "He is closing a deal on a retail plaza next week," Diane said, signaling the waiter for a glass of Chardonnay. "The commission will be staggering. Olivia is practically managing a small empire from their living room." I watched Olivia stir her ice water. Her smile was tight. The posture she held was rigid, lacking the relaxed confidence of someone actually sitting on a financial empire. Her knuckles were white around the glass. I noted the tension, filing it away the same way I flagged a mismatched pixel on a canvas. Something in her structural foundation was cracking. But Diane was too busy admiring the paint job to notice. I waited through the appetizers. I waited through Richard complaining about property taxes. I waited for a lull in the conversation that never naturally arrived. When the main courses were cleared, I set my napkin on the table. I took a breath, letting the ambient noise of the restaurant fade into the background. "I am getting married," I said. The words hung in the air over the empty dessert plates. I placed my left hand on the table, letting the ambient lighting catch the clean facets of the emerald-cut diamond. Richard blinked, looking from my hand to my face, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Olivia stopped stirring her water. Her eyes darted to the ring, performing a rapid, silent calculation of its carat weight and clarity. Diane did not gasp. She did not offer a congratulations. She leaned back against the leather booth and leveled a flat, assessing stare at me. "Julian?" she asked. "The computer guy." "Yes," I said. "Julian." Diane let out a short, dry breath. She picked up her wine glass, swirling the last few drops of Chardonnay. "How are you going to afford a wedding on an artist's salary, Ella?" Her tone was not an inquiry. It was an indictment. Weddings cost money. Real money. You cannot pay a caterer in digital drawings, and I doubt a freelance tech support worker has a venue budget sitting in his checking account. I kept my expression neutral. I did not mention the $5 billion Julian controlled. I did not mention the private trust he established for our future the day before. I prepared to tell her we were planning a small private ceremony that we would fund ourselves. I never got the chance to finish my sentence. Olivia leaned forward, slapping her palm flat against the table. The sudden movement shattered whatever fragile attention my engagement had commanded. Speaking of dates to remember, Olivia said her voice pitched half an octave higher than normal. Bradley and I finalized the booking for Miami. We are renting a tri-deck yacht for the third week of September. The pivot was instantaneous. It was a masterstroke of diversion, executed by a woman who had spent a lifetime ensuring no one else occupied the center frame. Diane dropped her wine glass back onto the table. The sharp critique in her eyes dissolved into sheer, unadulterated delight. "September," Diane repeated. "Oh, Olivia, that is brilliant. The weather in Miami is glorious in September. We need to look at resort wear immediately. You cannot wear last season's linen on a tri-deck." I sat motionless in the booth. My left hand was still resting on the table, the platinum band catching the light. Neither of my parents looked at it again. They spent the next 20 minutes dissecting the itinerary of a vacation they were not paying for. Richard animatedly discussed the logistics of docking fees and marina reservations. Diane pulled up a designer boutique on her phone, angling the screen so Olivia could review silk cover-ups and polarized sunglasses. My wedding, the union I had just announced 5 minutes prior, ceased to exist in their reality. I had proposed a September date in my mind, hoping to enjoy the crisp autumn air in Pennsylvania. Olivia claimed the month. My milestone was successfully overwritten by a boat rental. The waiter arrived with the leather folio containing the check. He set it in the center of the table, equidistant between Richard and me. Richard did not reach for it. He was too busy scrolling through photos of the marina on his phone. Diane was deep into a debate with Olivia regarding the merits of open-toe wedges on a teak deck. I reached across the table and pulled the leather folio toward me. I slid my credit card inside. As I signed the receipt, I allowed my eyes to wander over my family. I studied the manic, almost desperate energy Olivia projected while discussing the yacht's onboard chef. I noticed the fraying edge on the strap of her heavily logoed handbag. It was a detail the manufacturer would never allow past quality control unless the bag was a counterfeit or had been used relentlessly without replacement. True wealth is silent. It does not need to shout across a dinner table. It does not need to hijack a sister's engagement to prove it exists. The display in front of me was incredibly loud. It was the sound of an engine running on fumes, revving as hard as possible to mask the inevitable stall. I slipped my card back into my wallet and stood up. Diane barely registered my movement. She waved a hand in my general direction, her eyes still locked on the boutique website. "Drive safe, Ella," she murmured. "We will talk about your little plans later. Just do not expect us to fund a party when you two barely have steady incomes." I did not correct her. I did not demand they look at me. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool evening air. I drove back to my apartment, walked through the door, and found Julian reading a design brief on the sofa. He looked up, reading the quiet resignation in my posture. I sat down beside him. I told him we were going to plan the wedding exactly the way we wanted. I told him we were going strictly on our own terms. I decided to send the invitations through the mail, treating my family like standard guests rather than honored relatives. I assumed they would begrudgingly attend, perhaps sitting in the back, whispering critiques about the floral arrangements. I vastly underestimated my mother's commitment to her favorite child's charade. The formal invitation was about to trigger a response that would permanently sever the frail string holding us together. I approached the design of my wedding invitations the same way I approached a high-tier corporate contract. Every detail required intention. I spent 3 weeks curating the typography, selecting a font that was clean, modern, and lacking any unnecessary embellishments. I ordered thick cotton cardstock that felt substantial in the hand. The edges were painted a deep, rich emerald, matching the floral aesthetic I planned for the conservatory. The text was letterpressed, creating a satisfying, tactile indentation on the surface of the paper. I did not want a loud announcement. I wanted an artifact of pure harmony. When the suites were finally assembled, I hand-addressed the envelopes. I wrote my parents' address in Pennsylvania with a steady hand. I dropped their invitation into the blue postal box on the corner of my street, listening to the hollow thud as it hit the bottom. I told myself I was simply fulfilling a social obligation. I expected them to attend, perhaps sitting in the back row, whispering critiques to each other while waiting for the open bar. I was unprepared for the speed of their dismissal. 7 days later, I walked down to the lobby of my apartment building to check the mail. Mixed between a utility bill and a catalog was my own emerald-edged return envelope. I carried the stack upstairs. The apartment was quiet. Julian was at the Sterling Tech campus finalizing a quarterly report, leaving me alone with the afternoon light slanting across the hardwood floor. I set my keys on the counter. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced the top edge of the envelope. I pulled out the RSVP card. The front of the card featured 2 simple checkboxes: will attend, will decline. A sharp, jagged mark sat inside the will decline box. I stared at that mark for a long time. It was not drawn with a standard black or blue pen. The ink was a gaudy metallic gold. It was the kind of pen Diane kept in her purse to sign checks at charity luncheons, a tool designed to look expensive while executing mundane tasks. I turned the heavy cardstock over. The back of the card was blank, intended for dietary restrictions or a brief note of congratulations. Diane had used that space to deliver a verdict. Her handwriting, looping and hurried, stretched across the cotton paper in that same metallic gold ink. I read the words, standing in my silent kitchen. Ella, you know Olivia's yacht trip is that weekend. It's a bit of a joke that you didn't check with us first. We can't miss it. I read the sentence a second time, then a third. It's a bit of a joke. She did not express regret. She did not invent a polite scheduling conflict. She reduced the defining commitment of my life to a punchline, an irritating inconvenience that dared to overlap with a boat rental. The yacht trip was not even a milestone event. It was a random vacation. Yet, in the hierarchy of the Woods family, a weekend of wearing designer cover-ups on a rented deck held exponentially more weight than my marriage. I stood there, holding the card. I waited for the familiar sting of tears. I waited for the crushing weight of rejection to collapse my chest the way it used to when I was a teenager holding a $50 gift card. The tears never arrived. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity washed over me. I walked into my home office. I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a plain, unmarked manila folder. In my profession, documentation is everything. When a client requests a sudden change or denies a previous directive, you survive by pulling the source files. You maintain a pristine record of every version, every timestamp, every strict requirement. You do not argue with a client using emotion. You argue using data. I placed the RSVP card inside the manila folder. I did not crumple it. I treated it like a vital piece of evidence. Diane had unknowingly handed me a physical, documented proof of her priorities. She had signed her name to her own negligence. I closed the folder and left it sitting flat on the center of my desk. When Julian returned home that evening, he found me sitting in the dark glow of my dual monitors, rendering a new cosmic background. He set his briefcase down, loosened his tie, and walked over to my chair. He noticed the manila folder sitting out of place on my pristine workspace. He opened the cover. He read the front of the RSVP card. He flipped it over and read the metallic gold note on the back. He did not sigh. He did not offer empty platitudes about how families are complicated. Julian understood the mechanics of power and the cruelty of narcissism better than anyone I had ever met. He set the card down. He rested his hand on my shoulder, a steady, anchoring weight. "I can have the aviation team prep a jet," Julian said, his voice even and serious. "We can fly them out the morning of the ceremony and have them back in Miami by sunset. If it is a matter of logistics, I can remove the excuse." I looked up at him. I shook my head. "If you build a bridge for them, they will just complain about the architecture," I replied. "They do not want to come, Julian. They want me to know that my life is a joke compared to hers. I am not going to chase people who run away from me." Julian studied my face. He saw the cold resolve settling into my features. He closed the manila folder, leaving the physical evidence resting on my desk. Julian has a unique way of processing the world. When he encounters a problem, he does not offer hollow sympathy. He builds a structural solution. He knew I valued the tangibility of things. He knew I craved artifacts that proved my worth was real. 2 days later, a courier arrived at the apartment requiring a signature for a heavy wooden crate. Julian carried the crate into my office and set it on the floor. He handed me a small pry bar. I opened the lid, pulling away layers of dense protective foam. Resting at the bottom of the crate was a solid block of gleaming metal. During our early dating phase, I had designed a digital asset for a financial software interface. It was a 3-dimensional rendering of a gold bar. I spent weeks perfecting the light refraction, the texture of the stamped serial numbers, and the precise angles of the edges. I saved the final file as a PNG with a flawless, transparent background. It was a digital representation of pure, unattached value, an object that held worth entirely on its own, requiring no background to justify its existence. Julian had taken that exact source file, sent it to a private foundry, and commissioned a physical casting. I reached into the crate. The gold bar was astonishingly heavy. It was cool to the touch, the surface catching the ambient light of the room and throwing a warm, radiant glow across my desk. It was an exact, one-to-one physical replica of my digital design. Julian watched me hold it. "Your work has value," he said quietly. "You have value. It does not matter what kind of background you are placed against. The worth is inherent." He stepped forward, took the heavy gold bar from my hands, and placed it directly on top of the manila folder containing my mother's RSVP card. The gold pinned the cardboard flat against the desk. It was the perfect paperweight. It was a daily physical reminder that the rejection inside that folder was powerless against the reality of the life I had built. I looked at the folder trapped beneath the gold. I made a silent vow to myself. I would not send another email. I would not make another phone call. The RSVP was final. They made their choice, and I was going to let them live with the consequences of that choice. But families built on toxic hierarchies do not handle silence well. Diane expected me to call her crying. She expected me to beg for her attendance. When I offered only a smooth, impenetrable silence, her narrative began to fracture. Her real panic set in 3 weeks before the wedding date. My father's side of the family, a sprawling network of aunts, uncles, and cousins who lived across the Midwest, began receiving their emerald-edged invitations. Unlike Diane, they did not have a luxury yacht trip to attend. They looked at the date, checked their calendars, and began mailing their RSVP cards back with the "will attend" box enthusiastically checked. Diane had spent months boasting about Olivia's upcoming Miami excursion, expecting the extended family to fawn over the details. Instead, the family group chats began buzzing with travel plans for my wedding. Relatives were booking hotel rooms in Pennsylvania. They were coordinating rental cars. They were buying dresses. The spotlight Diane had carefully constructed for her golden child was suddenly swinging away, illuminating the daughter she had banished to the shadows. Diane could not tolerate a loss of attention. She could not fathom a scenario where my event overshadowed Olivia's luxury vacation. If she could not force the family to focus on Miami, she decided to poison the well in Pennsylvania. She picked up her phone and began a quiet, calculated campaign to destroy my character. Diane operated her social circle like a seasoned politician managing a fragile coalition. Her currency was influence, and her primary tool was the telephone. Whenever a narrative threatened to slip from her grasp, she would retreat to the sunroom in the Pennsylvania house, pour a cup of black tea, and begin dialing. With the wedding 3 weeks away, the RSVP cards flooding my mailbox told a story Diane could not abide. Aunts, uncles, and cousins from the Midwest were booking flights to my city. They were reserving hotel rooms. They were buying gifts. They were doing the one thing my mother deemed unforgivable. They were paying attention to the wrong daughter. To Diane, attention was a zero-sum game. Every relative attending my ceremony was a relative not swooning over Olivia's yacht itinerary. If she could not force the extended family to look at Miami, she decided to make them regret looking at me. She launched a whisper campaign. It was an orchestrated effort cloaked in maternal concern. She did not yell or throw tantrums. She called her sisters and sisters-in-law, using a measured, sorrowful tone. She planted seeds of doubt, cultivating a narrative that framed me as a bitter, jealous sibling trying to ruin Olivia's hard-earned vacation. I learned the exact shape of this fabricated story on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my home office applying a final color grade to a client's digital asset. I had designed a sprawling, cosmic background, ensuring the layout remained vibrant and breathable. I spent an hour eliminating errant visual noise, removing unnecessary dry branches from a foreground silhouette to maintain perfect aesthetic harmony. My phone rang, breaking the quiet focus of the room. The caller ID displayed the name of my father's sister, Aunt Helen. Helen lived in Ohio. She was a woman who navigated family dynamics by aligning herself with whoever held the most perceived authority. In our family, that authority belonged to Diane. Helen was a loyal soldier, a woman who treated gossip as gospel and rarely bothered to verify the facts. She was a red herring in the grand scheme of my mother's war. She sounded like the enemy, but she was merely a proxy, repeating a script handed to her by the actual architect of the conflict. I answered the call, placing the phone on speaker while I continued adjusting the contrast levels on my monitor. Ella Helen said, her voice sharp and brittle, "I need to understand what you are doing." I did not stop clicking my mouse. "What am I doing, Helen?" "You are forcing this family to choose," she snapped. "Your mother is sick with worry. She told me how you deliberately scheduled your wedding on the exact same weekend as Olivia's trip, just to steal the spotlight. It is incredibly selfish. You know how hard Olivia works, and you are trying to overshadow her out of sheer spite." I paused my editing. The cursor hovered over a pixel of light. The narrative was brilliant in its sheer audacity. Diane had inverted the timeline, turning her own negligence into my weapon. Helen continued, her breathing heavy through the speaker. "And your mother is terrified for your financial future. She said Julian does not even have a steady paycheck. You are paying for a wedding you cannot afford, marrying a lazy freelancer and dragging the whole family into your drama. Why are you being so stubborn?" I leaned back in my chair. I looked at the heavy gold paperweight Julian had cast for me sitting on the corner of my desk. I thought about the $5 billion valuation of Sterling Tech. I thought about the private trust sitting in my name. People who rely on volume to win arguments expect you to meet their decibel level. They want you to shout. They want you to become defensive, because defensiveness looks like guilt. If you raise your voice, they can dismiss you as irrational. I do not raise my voice. I treat accusations the same way I treat a flawed design brief. I strip away the emotional clutter and present the cold, structural facts. "Helen," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. The pitch of my voice did not shift a single degree. "Did Diane tell you when Olivia booked the yacht?" Helen hesitated. The lack of reciprocal anger threw off her rhythm. "She booked it a few months ago. Why does that matter?" "I sent the save the dates out 6 months before she made that reservation," I replied. "The envelopes were postmarked in March. Olivia booked her boat in September. You still have the save the date on your refrigerator, do you not?" Silence stretched across the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she mentally checked the dates. "You can check the postmarks, Helen. I did not schedule my life around my sister's vacation. My sister scheduled her vacation over my wedding." "But your mother said—" "My mother lied," I stated, cutting through the remaining static. "She is embarrassed because she chose a boat over her daughter, and now she realizes the rest of the family is not making that same mistake. She is trying to make you feel guilty for attending." The line remained quiet. The proxy soldier was suddenly disarmed, holding a weapon that had been loaded with blanks. And as for Julian, I added my voice, softening into a register of calm, unyielding certainty. "Julian provides for me in ways this family never could. You do not need to worry about my finances. We are doing just fine." I did not offer further explanations. I did not defend Julian's work ethic or detail his non-existent freelance struggles. Providing evidence to a pawn is a waste of resources. The truth was going to arrive soon enough, and it was going to be broadcast on a scale Diane could never manipulate. "I will see you at the ceremony, Helen. Drive safe." I ended the call. I stared at the black screen of my phone. The brief exchange clarified the sheer depth of Diane's desperation. She was terrified. Her entire identity rested on her ability to curate the Woods family image. For nearly 3 decades, she successfully dictated the lighting, the staging, and the script. Olivia was the star. I was the dark, unlit corner. Now the lighting was shifting. The audience was turning their chairs to face a different stage. Diane could not halt the production, so she was attempting to burn down the theater. I picked up my phone and dialed Julian. He answered on the first ring, the faint hum of his corporate headquarters echoing in the background. "She is mobilizing the relatives," I told him. "She is spinning a story that I orchestrated the date to ruin Olivia's trip, and that you are an unemployed burden dragging me into debt." A low, rich chuckle sounded through the receiver. Julian rarely laughed out loud, but the sheer absurdity of Diane's script amused him. He understood the fragile architecture of a lie. When a competitor builds a product on a flawed foundation, you do not interrupt them. You let them launch it, and you watch it collapse under its own weight. "Let them talk," Julian said. "The PR team finalized the press strategy this morning. The embargo lifts the minute we say our vows. By the time they wake up on that boat, the narrative will no longer belong to them." He was right. Diane believed she controlled the distribution of information because she commanded a telephone tree of Midwestern ants. She had zero comprehension of the machinery Julian was about to unleash. The final 2 weeks leading up to the ceremony were marked by a tense, heavy silence from Pennsylvania. No texts, no calls, no last-minute attempts at reconciliation. Diane and Richard were packing their designer luggage. Olivia was finalizing her resort wear. They were boarding a flight to Florida, secure in their belief that they had successfully relegated my milestone to a trivial footnote. I spent those final days finalizing the details of the conservatory. I walked through the venue, ensuring the rich, cinematic tones of the floral arrangements were balanced. I instructed the lighting technicians to avoid any harsh, blinding spotlights, opting instead for a warm, radiant glow that highlighted the deep emerald leaves and vibrant orchids. I demanded an environment devoid of visual clutter. I wanted a setting that reflected the life I was building, intentional, precise, and breathing with quiet strength. The stage was set. The trap Diane built for herself was fully constructed. All that remained was for the cameras to start rolling. Tell me something. Have you ever let someone continue telling a lie because you held the undeniable proof that would eventually shatter their reality? It requires a specific kind of patience to stand in the shadows while someone else claims the light. knowing the dawn is about to break. If you have ever played the long game against a manipulator, share your strategy in the comments, because the sun was about to rise on the Woods family, and the glare was going to be blinding. The glass conservatory held its breath as Julianne slipped the platinum band onto my finger. I did not cast a second glance toward the empty velvet cushions in the front row. I maintained the exact unyielding posture I had perfected over years of meticulous isolation. I looked at the man standing across from me, absorbing the quiet certainty in his eyes. We sealed the vows. The string quartet began a bright, soaring arrangement, and we walked down the aisle to the quiet rhythm of camera shutters. Executing a secret wedding for a man who controls a vast segment of the global technology sector requires a logistical framework tighter than a military operation. In an era where every caterer carries a smartphone and airspace is crowded with telephoto lenses, privacy is not requested, it is engineered. Julian treated our ceremony the same way I treat a complex digital rendering. He eliminated all margin for error. He scrubbed the environment of unauthorized variables. Our marriage license was filed weeks prior under a specialized blind trust, shielded by layers of corporate non-disclosure agreements. The venue itself was a private architectural fortress nestled deep within a forested mountain range. The structure utilized sweeping panes of glass and natural stone, resembling a flawless, high-definition canvas. I spent months curating the visual aesthetic of the interior. I rejected the somber, pitch-dark palettes common in modern evening galas. I insisted on radiant, vibrant lighting that illuminated the deep emerald foliage and high-contrast orchids. I pruned away every stray wire, every misplaced floral stand, and every awkward shadow, ensuring the room breathed with perfect, uninterrupted harmony. The reception flowed with frictionless grace. Tech executives and venture capitalists mingled seamlessly with my Midwestern relatives. I watched Aunt Helen from across the room. She sat at table 4, clutching a crystal champagne flute, her eyes darting nervously around the cavernous space. She saw the flawless staging, the understated wealth, and the quiet, undeniable authority Julian projected. Her posture shrank. She realized the script Diane had fed her. The narrative of a desperate, underfunded mistake was a spectacular fabrication. Helen stayed quiet the entire evening, too intimidated by the reality of the room to utter a single complaint. The real masterpiece, however, was not the evening itself. It was the morning after. Julian did not just desire a private wedding. He wanted total command over the public revelation. He understood that controlling the flow of information is the ultimate leverage. He instructed his corporate public relations team to draft a press release embargoed until the exact moment he dictated. We woke up in the master suite of the estate. The room was bathed in the crisp golden light of dawn filtering through a panoramic window that framed the mountains like a perfect 16:9 cinematic shot. The air was incredibly still. We ordered coffee and sat on the edge of the plush mattress, the heavy silence offering a stark contrast to the storm we were about to summon. Julian checked his watch. He tapped a single icon on his tablet, sending the authorization code to his communications director in Seattle. The strike was timed with mathematical precision. He lifted the embargo at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This was the precise hour Olivia's rented tri-deck yacht was scheduled to pull back into the Miami marina to refuel. It was the exact moment their phones would reconnect to the shore-based cell towers, flooding their devices with whatever data they had missed while out on the water. I picked up the television remote and turned on the screen mounted opposite the bed. We tuned in to a prominent national morning broadcast, a show that blended hard market analysis with high society entertainment. The female anchor sat behind a polished glass desk, shuffling a stack of blue cue cards. A breaking news graphic flashed across the lower third of the screen, painted in urgent, saturated colors. The anchor looked directly into the studio camera. "We have a major surprise this morning out of the tech world," she announced, her voice bright and practiced. Julian Sterling, the elusive founder and CEO of Sterling Tech, is officially off the market. The screen cut from the news desk to a pristine, high-resolution photograph taken during our ceremony. The image filled the broadcast, It captured the vibrant, luminous background I had so carefully designed. It showed the sharp, clean lines of my silk gown and Julian looking down at me with a rare, unguarded warmth. The composition was flawless, devoid of any visual noise. The chyron across the bottom of the screen updated. The text read, "Tech Titan weds private artist in stunning secret ceremony." Sterling, whose company recently passed a $5 billion valuation, managed to keep the entire event under wraps. The anchor continued over the footage. He married Pennsylvania-based digital designer Ella Woods in a highly secured private mountain estate. Sources say the guest list was incredibly exclusive, blending Silicon Valley elite with the bride's close family. I listened to her pronounce my name, Ella Woods, not Olivia's sister, not Diane's quiet afterthought, a sought-after digital designer standing on equal footing with an industry giant. My smartphone was resting on the cold marble surface of the nightstand. For 28 years, that device had functioned as a tether to my family's demands. It was the delivery mechanism for Diane's passive-aggressive critiques, Richard's evasive texts, and Olivia's endless requests for attention. It was a tool of anxiety. At 8:15, the screen illuminated. A second later, the internal motor engaged. The phone vibrated against the marble, producing a sharp, buzzing rattle. It stopped for a fraction of a second, then vibrated again. Then, the rhythm escalated. The device began to dance across the smooth stone surface, emitting a continuous, frantic hum. It sounded like a trapped wasp. The sheer volume of incoming data was overwhelming the processor. I did not reach for it immediately. I sat on the edge of the mattress, sipping my coffee, watching the incoming alerts stack on top of one another. Julian leaned back against the headboard, his eyes tracking the vibrating device. He did not say a word. He just let the reality of the moment settle over the room. I finally set my ceramic mug on the coaster, walked over to the nightstand, and picked up the phone. The lock screen was a cascading waterfall of panic. 17 missed calls, 24 unread text messages, 5 new voicemails. I scrolled through the notification banner. Every single alert carried the same familiar area code from Pennsylvania. The names flashing across the glass were the same people who had mailed back my emerald-edged invitations with mocking notes. Diane, Richard, Olivia. Even Aunt Helen had sent a frantic, misspelled message. The architecture of our family dynamic. A hierarchy, frozen in place for decades, inverted in a matter of seconds. The power shifted so rapidly, the sheer force of it felt tangible in the air. They were no longer the gatekeepers of my worth. They were spectators locked outside the fortress, banging their fists against the gates they had voluntarily walked away from. I swiped the screen to unlock it, opening the group thread my mother had used to send the yacht photograph just days prior. The message waiting for me inside that thread was a masterpiece of desperate backpedaling. The glass screen of the phone felt cool against my palm. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, letting the ambient morning light wash over the room. The panoramic window framed the distant mountain peaks like a flawless 16:9 cinematic shot, bathing the space in a warm, radiant glow. Julian watched me from his place against the headboard. His expression remained steady, offering no pressure. He understood the profound weight of this digital artifact. I bypassed the list of missed calls and navigated directly to the voicemail inbox. The visual stack of audio files served as a testament to pure panic. Diane had left 3 separate recordings within a 10-minute window. Richard left 1, Olivia left 2. I tapped the play icon on my mother's first message. I held the device a few inches from my ear, bracing for the usual sharp, clipped cadence. I expected the tone she always used when I failed to meet a trivial expectation or forgot my place in the background. Instead, a frantic, sugary pitch spilled out of the tiny speaker. It was a vocal register I had not heard directed at me in my entire 28 years of existence. "Ella, darling," Diane gasped. The background noise of her recording was a chaotic mess of auditory clutter. I could hear the slap of water against a hull, the screech of gulls, and the low rumble of marine engines. "We just turned on the television in the main cabin," she continued, her breathing shallow and fast. "We saw the broadcast. Honey, why on earth did you keep this a secret? We are in shock. Julian is well. He is Julian Sterling. Call me the second you hear this. We need to celebrate. We are family." I listened to the recording a second time. I analyzed the vocal fluctuations the same way I would inspect a gradient transition on a digital canvas, looking for the truth hidden beneath the layers. There was zero genuine affection in her delivery. The breathless excitement was a manufactured overlay, a cheap filter applied to mask a terrifying reality. She was not thrilled for my happiness. She was horrified by her own catastrophic miscalculation. I deleted the audio file. I did not bother listening to the messages from Richard or Olivia. Their scripts would simply be variations of the same desperate theme orchestrated by the woman currently losing her grip on the narrative. I opened the text messaging application. The group thread, previously dominated by photographs of teak decks and designer sunglasses, now displayed a solid wall of green text bubbles. Diane had fired off a rapid sequence of demands. "Ella, we saw the news. Why didn't you tell us Julian was that Julian Sterling? We are family. Where are you?" I stared at the glowing pixels forming those words. We are family. The phrase was a crowbar. It was an emotional tool designed to pry open a vault she had spent her life ignoring. She weaponized that word, hoping the sheer weight of biology would erase decades of neglect. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. For a fleeting second, the old instincts flared to life. The ghost in the Pennsylvania house wanted to draft a long, articulate paragraph. I wanted to list every grievance with razor-sharp typography. I wanted to remind her about the $50 gift card I received while Olivia drove away in a silver sedan. I wanted to type out the exact dimensions of the empty reserve chairs sitting in the front row of the conservatory. I wanted to demand a groveling apology for the metallic gold ink smeared across my RSVP card. I wanted to explain my pain, but I stopped. I pulled my thumb back from the letters. I realized a crucial truth sitting in that sunlit room. When you explain your pain to people committed to misunderstanding you, you hand them power. You give them a roadmap to your vulnerabilities. A long, emotional paragraph would validate Diane's belief that she still controlled my emotional state. It would signal that I still craved her approval, that I was still fighting for a seat at her table. I did not want a seat at her table anymore. I owned the building. I did not type a single letter. I switched the keyboard to the emoji interface. I scanned the colorful icons, bypassing the angry faces and the broken hearts. I searched for a symbol that required zero translation and offered zero leverage. I selected a single, simple image, the face with tears of joy. I pasted it into the text box. No words, no punctuation, just a digital representation of uncontrollable laughter. I pressed send. The tiny icon appeared on the screen, a solitary response to her wall of frantic demands. It was the ultimate dismissal. It reduced her engineered panic, her faux maternal concern, and her sudden, desperate interest in my life to a punchline. She called my wedding a joke. I returned the favor. I swiped down from the top of the screen and toggled the Do Not Disturb feature. A small crescent moon icon appeared in the status bar, erecting an impenetrable digital wall around my piece. The buzzing stopped. The influx of panic was silenced. The room returned to perfect, breathable harmony. I tossed the phone onto the soft duvet. Julian raised an eyebrow, offering a silent inquiry. I sent an emoji, I told him. He smiled a slow, appreciative curve of his mouth and picked up his coffee cup. I want to pause right here and talk directly to you. Have you ever felt the overwhelming urge to write a novel to someone who hurt you? Have you ever drafted a long, furious message in your notes application, hoping that if you just found the perfect combination of words, they would finally understand the damage they caused? If you have, I want you to know the staggering empowerment of pressing delete. You do not owe an explanation to anyone who skipped your hardest days and only showed up for your harvest. Silence is not a surrender. It is a boundary. It is the removal of visual and emotional clutter. When you stop trying to convince toxic people of your worth, you free up the energy to build a life they can never access. If you have ever chosen the strength of silence over the exhaustion of an argument, let me know in the comments. Your peace is worth protecting. But peace, as I was about to discover, is rarely left unchallenged by those who thrive on extraction. Diane was sitting on that rented boat in Miami, staring at a single laughing emoji. I knew her psychological profile better than anyone. She would not view that rejection as a final door closing. She would view it as a temporary obstacle blocking a vast, untapped reserve of capital. The luxury facade she curated for Olivia was incredibly expensive to maintain. The designer bags, the yacht rentals, the upscale zip codes, none of it was sustained by genuine wealth. Diane saw Julian's $5 billion valuation broadcast on national television, and she did not see a son-in-law. She saw a rescue vessel. Olivia's carefully constructed image was already beginning to fracture. The frayed strap on the handbag at our engagement dinner was just a surface symptom. Beneath the veneer of resort wear and champagne flutes, a terrifying financial rot was spreading through their lives. Diane was not going to let a single text message stand between her favorite daughter and the ultimate bailout. She was going to return to Pennsylvania, regroup her forces, and launch an offensive designed to pry open my new life. She thought I was still the quiet, compliant ghost she raised. She had no idea the kind of unyielding structure I had built to protect myself. The true depths of their desperation were about to be exposed, and the documents revealing their ruin were already sitting inside a thick file on a desk in Julian's corporate security office. 14 days after the national broadcast, the digital barricade I erected around my peace remained under relentless assault. Diane did not interpret my single laughing emoji as a closed door. To a woman whose entire social standing was built on leverage, a locked door merely signaled that the prize inside was worth breaking a window to acquire. She began cycling through alternate phone numbers. When I blocked Richard's cell, she used the landline. When I blocked the landline, she commandeered phones belonging to her country club acquaintances, leaving voicemails dripping with manufactured maternal concern. The narrative she spun for these confused bystanders was a masterclass in distortion. She played the heartbroken mother desperately trying to reconnect with a daughter who had achieved sudden, blinding success and forgotten her roots. I ignored every single attempt. I spent those 2 weeks enjoying the quiet, structured rhythm of my new life. Julian and I settled into our primary residence, an architectural marvel overlooking a winding river defined by clean lines, expansive glass, and perfect symmetry. I established my design studio in a sunlit wing of the house, focusing my energy on rendering vibrant, high-contrast assets for upcoming tech campaigns. But the noise from Pennsylvania refused to dissipate. It escalated. Diane started sending physical letters via overnight couriers, demanding a sit-down conversation to heal the family rift. On a Thursday evening, the persistent harassment finally reached a threshold that required a structural response. I was sitting at the polished oak dining table reviewing a digital portfolio on my tablet. Julian walked into the room. He was not wearing his usual tailored suit jacket, having just finished a video conference with his board of directors. He carried a dense, unmarked legal folder in his left hand. He pulled out the chair next to me and sat down. He placed the heavy folder on the oak surface. The dull thud of the paper against the wood echoed in the quiet room. I looked at the folder, then up at his face. His expression was serious, carrying the calm, calculating weight of a CEO about to present a ruinous quarterly earnings report. When we filed the marriage license, my chief of security ran a standard due diligence check on your immediate relatives, Julian said. His voice was steady, offering no apologies for the intrusion. It is standard protocol for anyone entering the inner circle of the executive trust. We look for liabilities pending litigation or unmanaged risks. I rested my hands on the table. You found a liability. I found a structural collapse, Julian corrected. The report crossed my desk 3 weeks ago. I reviewed the data the night before our ceremony. A sharp chill prickled the back of my neck. I realized he had walked down the aisle carrying the weight of my family's secrets, actively choosing to shoulder the burden alone so my mind could remain clear. "Why did you keep it hidden?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Because it was our wedding day," he replied, holding my gaze. "You spent your entire childhood managing their visual clutter. I refused to let their chaos pollute the one event that belonged entirely to us. The canvas needed to remain pristine. But now that Diane is attempting to bypass your boundaries, you need to understand the true nature of her panic. She is not chasing a relationship, Ella. She is chasing a lifeline." Julian slid the folder across the polished oak. I opened the cover. The top sheet was an executive summary drafted by a premier corporate intelligence firm. Below it lay dozens of pages of financial disclosures, court filings, and banking records. I bypassed the summary and went straight to the source data. In my line of work, you do not trust the interpretation. You study the raw pixels. The first section detailed Bradley's commercial real estate ventures. Diane had spent years praising his empire, portraying him as a visionary conquering new zip codes. The documents painted a starkly different picture. Bradley was not a mogul. He was a desperate man operating a fraudulent house of cards. His investment firm consisted of high-interest bridge loans stacked precariously on top of one another. He secured capital from private investors by promising staggering returns on commercial developments that never actually broke ground. He used funds from new investors to pay the interest owed to early backers. It was a classic, unsustainable Ponzi structure, and the foundation was currently disintegrating. I turned the page. A red flag icon marked a federal document. The Securities and Exchange Commission had opened an active investigation into Bradley's firm. Subpoenas were already circulating. Imminent bankruptcy was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked at a series of receipts and bank transfers appended to the next section. They detailed the expenditures for the Miami tri-deck yacht. The rental fees, the onboard chef, the premium champagne, it amounted to an astronomical sum. I traced the dates on the invoices. The timeline clicked into perfect, horrifying focus. The yacht trip was never a celebration. It was not a vacation. It was a staged theatrical performance. Bradley rented that tri-deck vessel to project an illusion of vast liquidity. He invited high-net-worth individuals onto that teak deck to lure in a final round of emergency capital before the federal regulators froze his accounts. Olivia was parading around in designer sunglasses, acting as a prop in a desperate scheme to stave off federal indictment. They missed my wedding to run a financial scam on a rented boat. But the true horror of the dossier was buried in the final section. If Bradley's firm was illiquid, he could not have funded the yacht deposit himself. The money had to originate from a secondary source. I flipped to a thick stack of property records. The heading identified the asset, a 2-story colonial house with green shutters in Pennsylvania. The home I grew up in. The house where I was treated like discarded furniture. 6 months prior, Richard and Diane took out a ruinous home equity line of credit. They leveraged every cent of equity they had built over 3 decades. The banking records showed the funds transferring directly from their joint account into a holding company controlled by Bradley. They mortgaged their shelter to fund their golden child's illusion. Now, with Bradley's accounts frozen by the impending investigation, the monthly payments on that loan had ceased. I stared at a printed notice from a regional bank. It was a formal declaration of default. Foreclosure proceedings were scheduled to initiate within 30 days. My parents were on the verge of losing the house. The frantic voicemails, the sudden sickly sweet texts, the demands to reconnect. They had nothing to do with familial love. Diane watched the national broadcast and realized her invisible, overlooked daughter had married a man possessing enough capital to erase her catastrophic mistakes with a single keystroke. I was not her child. I was a $5 billion off-ramp. I leaned closer to the foreclosure notice, my eyes scanning the bottom of the page where the loan origination signatures were appended. A specific detail caught my attention. It was a minor anomaly, the kind of visual discrepancy a digital designer is trained to flag. The bank officer had signed the document using a standard blue ballpoint pen. Richard's signature was scrawled in black ink, but Diane's signature, looping and hurried, stood out against the stark white paper. The ink she used to sign away the family home was highly specific. It was a gaudy, reflective, metallic gold. I froze. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning faded into absolute silence. I recognized that exact ink. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone, unlocking the screen. I navigated to a secure cloud folder where I kept digital scans of important documents. I opened the scanned image of the RSVP card my mother had mailed back to me weeks ago. I zoomed in on the handwritten note scrawled across the back. Ella, you know Olivia's yacht trip is that weekend. It's a bit of a joke that you didn't check with us first. I placed the glowing screen next to the printed loan document. The ink was identical. The sheer poetry of the betrayal was staggering. Diane had used the very same metallic gold pen to sign the financial instrument that destroyed her life and to write the mocking rejection that severed her relationship with me. The instrument of her ruin and the instrument of her cruelty were authored with the exact same tool. I set the phone down. I closed the thick legal dossier. The leather cover fell shut with a definitive, satisfying finality. I did not feel a trace of sorrow for the impending loss of the colonial house. I did not care about Olivia's collapsing facade or Bradley's federal troubles. They had engineered their own destruction, laying the bricks of their demise, while simultaneously tearing down my milestones. Julian watched my face, waiting for the emotional fallout. She used the same pen, I said softly. He tilted his head, processing the statement. I traced a finger over the smooth leather cover of the file. She signed away her house to fund a fraud, and she used the same pen to call my life a joke. A cold, quiet understanding passed between us. The trap Diane found herself in was entirely of her own making. She had built a fortress out of dry branches, and now she was shocked to discover it was highly flammable. This changes the threat level, Julian noted, leaning forward. She is not going to stop at sending couriers. Desperation breeds audacity. She will try to force your hand. She will try to corner you. Let her try, I replied. The shift in my internal architecture was profound. The lingering ghost of the neglected daughter evaporated, replaced by the precise, unyielding geometry of a woman holding undeniable proof. Diane thought she was preparing to extract wealth from a naive artist. She had no idea she was about to step into a meticulously designed crossfire. The harassment was about to graduate from frantic texts to a calculated extortion attempt. Diane was preparing to weaponize the extended family, hoping public pressure would force me to open the vault. She wanted a bailout. I was going to hand her an execution. Diane realized her direct lines of communication were severed. The blocked phone numbers and returned courier packages forced her to change tactics. She pivoted from direct intrusion to proxy warfare. She began utilizing the extended relatives, treating their inherent Midwestern guilt as a battering ram to breach my digital walls. The gossip reached me through isolated text messages and unsolicited voicemails from cousins I had not spoken to in years. The narrative Diane seeded was brilliant in its manipulation. She painted herself as a heartbroken matriarch facing an unspecified, sudden financial ruin. According to her script, I was the prodigal daughter who married into elite society and immediately turned my back on the people who raised me. She used phrases like our darkest hour and turning a blind eye to suffering. She never mentioned Bradley's fraudulent investments. She omitted any reference to the Miami yacht rental. She merely suggested that my new tax bracket had stripped away my humanity, turning me into a cold corporate entity. Aunt Helen left a 3-minute voicemail sobbing about family loyalty. A cousin sent a long message accusing me of forgetting where I came from. The hypocrisy was staggering. I came from a childhood spent wearing outdated clothes and working double shifts at a local diner to afford community college textbooks. Diane was attempting to erase my actual history and replace it with a fiction where I was a spoiled heiress abandoning my generous benefactors. On a Tuesday morning, this proxy warfare culminated in a direct, documented strike. I was sitting in my studio adjusting the hue saturation on a client's branding package. A notification pinged on my secondary monitor. A message bypassed my strict spam filters because it originated from an antiquated internet service provider address Diane rarely utilized. The subject line was typed in all capital letters, "Saving the Family Legacy." I opened the window. The text on the screen was devoid of any maternal warmth or preliminary pleasantries. It was a business proposition masquerading as a desperate plea. Diane outlined the impending foreclosure on the Colonial House. She glossed over the mechanics of how the debt accumulated, waving away the ruinous home equity line of credit as a minor misunderstanding caused by Bradley's overly ambitious commercial endeavors. She claimed they were innocent victims of a ruthless economy and predatory lending practices. She described the potential loss of the property as a tragedy that would destroy the Woods' legacy. Then she presented the demand. She did not ask for advice. She did not ask if Julian's financial advisors could review their portfolio. She explicitly requested a $300,000 wire transfer to clear the immediate arrears and stabilize Bradley's holding company. She called the transaction a loan, though the structure of her request offered 0 terms of repayment, no interest rate, and 0 legal collateral. It was a demand for a blank check. The closing paragraph contained a line of such calculating audacity, it felt like a physical drop in temperature within the room. "You have billions now, Ella. This is pocket change to you. We need a family meeting to resolve this before the bank takes our home. Blood is thicker than water." I read the words twice. Pocket change, blood is thicker than water. I stepped away from the monitor. I walked over to the expansive window overlooking the river, watching the water cut a steady, unyielding path through the landscape. A strange, numbing calm washed over my skin. It was not anger. Anger implies a loss of control, a chaotic reaction to an unexpected wound. I did not feel wounded. I felt an icy, architectural clarity. The physical sensation was akin to watching a complex algorithm execute perfectly on the first trial. The predictability of her greed was almost soothing. She viewed the $5 billion valuation of Sterling Tech as a communal asset. She believed my marriage was a winning lottery ticket purchased on her behalf. I calculated the sheer mathematics of her audacity. When I graduated high school, my future was deemed worth a $50 piece of plastic. When I announced my engagement, the event was considered a joke not worth attending. But now, faced with the consequences of her own fraudulent vanity, she decided my worth was exactly $300,000. The entitlement required to ignore a daughter's wedding, mock her existence, and then demand a 6-figure bailout utilizing the defense of shared biology was breathtaking. She was attempting to extort me using the very concept of kinship she had spent 28 years actively dismantling. I could have dragged the message into the digital trash bin. I could have strengthened the firewall, hired a legal team to issue cease and desist orders, and faded into a quiet, untouchable existence. But running away allows the aggressor to control the final chapter of the story. If I ignored the demand, Diane would spend the rest of her life playing the victimized mother. She would attend every holiday gathering, spin her tragic tale to the aunts and uncles, and paint me as the villain who let her starve while eating off silver plates. The smear campaign would outlive her. Julian walked into the studio carrying 2 cups of black coffee. He saw my posture by the window and followed my line of sight to the glowing monitor. He set the cups down, leaned over the desk, and read the glowing text. He straightened up, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. "I can have corporate counsel draft a response by noon," he offered, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We can bury them in litigation so deep they will never find the surface." I shook my head. I turned away from the window and walked back to my ergonomic chair. "No lawyers," I said softly. "Litigation takes years. It gives them a platform to argue. I am not going to argue with her. I am going to end this." I placed my hands on the keyboard. I clicked reply. I did not type a sprawling emotional rejection. I did not list her failures or demand an apology for the empty seats at my ceremony. I agreed to the family meeting, but I dictated the parameters. I chose a high-end, exclusive country club in Pennsylvania, a venue located 10 miles from their crumbling colonial home. It was a space requiring strict reservations, a rigid dress code, and an atmosphere of hushed, refined silence. It was a public setting where raised voices and dramatic outbursts were frowned upon. A place where Diane would be forced to maintain her pristine social mask, trapping her inside the very image she worshipped. I set the date for the following Sunday at noon. I hit send. The electronic swoosh signaled the departure of the trap. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a sleek, unmarked leather folder. The preparation for a quiet execution does not require weapons or raised voices. It requires unassailable documentation. I opened the thick legal dossier Julian had provided days earlier. I extracted the bank notice detailing the ruinous home equity loan, verifying the gaudy, metallic gold signature at the bottom. I printed a high-resolution, time-stamped screenshot of my mother's yacht photograph from the exact hour I walked down the aisle. I retrieved the original emerald-edged RSVP card containing her handwritten punchline. I slid each artifact into the leather folder, arranging them with the same meticulous care I used to balance a digital canvas. Every document was a calculated stroke, designed to strip away the visual clutter of her lies and reveal the stark, undeniable truth underneath. Diane thought she had summoned a terrified, compliant ghost to a negotiation table. She believed she could leverage public pressure and familial guilt to extract a fortune. She had no idea she was walking into a meticulously designed crossfire, orchestrated by a daughter who had mastered the art of holding the line. The drive from our home to the Pennsylvania state line took precisely 3 hours. Julian offered to accompany me on the journey. He proposed utilizing his corporate security detail, suggesting a discreet team to monitor the perimeter of the venue. I declined both offers. Bringing a billionaire husband or a team of guards alters the fundamental power dynamic of the room. It projects fear. It suggests I require a physical shield to face the ghosts of my childhood. A shield is a tool utilized by someone anticipating a battle. I was not traveling to engage in a skirmish. I was traveling to deliver a finalized ledger. The venue I selected for this encounter was the Oakmont Valley Country Club. It was a sprawling estate characterized by manicured greens and severe colonial architecture. The rules inside the building were rigid and uncompromising. Cell phones were strictly prohibited in the dining areas. Voices were expected to remain at a polite, muted register. The waitstaff moved like shadows, trained to intercept and smother disruption before it could materialize. Diane worshipped environments like this. She equated strict dress codes and exclusionary membership fees with moral superiority. By choosing Oakmont, I locked her inside her own preferred cage. If she caused a scene, raised her voice, or attempted a theatrical display of tears, she would forfeit the social standing she valued above oxygen. I carried a single item into the building. It was a black, full-grain leather folder devoid of any monograms, logos, or branding. Inside that sleek casing sat the high-resolution screenshot of the yacht, the bank foreclosure notice, featuring the metallic gold signature and the emerald-edged RSVP card. I also packed the solid gold paperweight Julian had cast for me. The metal was astonishingly heavy, resting at the bottom of my structured handbag. It felt like an anchor. It was a physical reminder of pure, unattached value, grounding me to the reality I had built. I chose my attire with the same calculated intent I applied to my digital canvases. I wore a tailored charcoal suit. The cut was sharp, the fabric matte. I wore no jewelry aside from my simple platinum wedding band. I did not dress to impress my relatives or to flaunt the Sterling Tech wealth. I dressed like a forensic auditor arriving to review a bankrupt account. The host guided me through the arched mahogany doors of the main dining room. The space smelled of lemon polish and starched linen. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, diffused glow over the widely spaced tables. The ambient noise consisted of clinking silverware and low murmuring conversations of established wealth. I spotted my family immediately in the back corner. They occupied a large round table designed to accommodate 6 guests. Diane sat facing the entrance, positioning herself as the focal point of the gathering. Richard sat to her left. Olivia was positioned on her right. But the remaining seats were not empty. Diane had orchestrated her ambush with predictable precision. She invited Aunt Helen, the proxy soldier from Ohio, along with Uncle David, the family's unofficial patriarch and primary gossip conduit. She assembled a jury. She believed that cornering me in front of these specific extended relatives would force me to open my checkbook. She calculated that the pressure of a public setting, combined with the watchful eyes of the elders, would strip away my boundaries. She wanted witnesses to watch the prodigal daughter surrender the requested $300,000. It was a classic extortion tactic, leveraging shame and familial obligation in a space where I could not easily retreat. I paused near a marble pillar, taking a moment to analyze their visual composition before stepping into their line of sight. The reality of their financial decay was beginning to bleed through the carefully constructed facade. Diane wore a pristine navy blue dress, the specific garment she reserved for Sunday church services and high-stakes social negotiations. Her posture was rigidly straight, her smile painted on with a striking coral lipstick. But the edges of her performance were fraying. Her hands rested flat on the crisp white tablecloth, and her fingers tapped a nervous, erratic rhythm against the linen. She was a director realizing her lead actor forgot the script. Olivia looked exponentially worse. The golden child was visibly exhausted. The designer veneer she spent her life maintaining was cracking under the crushing weight of Bradley's impending federal indictment. She wore a silk blouse, but the fabric was uncharacteristically wrinkled near the collar. The dark circles under her eyes were poorly masked by thick layers of concealer. She was staring at her empty water glass with the vacant, hollow expression of a passenger realizing the ship is already taking on water. Her manic energy from the engagement dinner was gone, replaced by a suffocating dread. Richard looked away the moment he saw me approach the table. He found a sudden, consuming interest in the silver salt shaker sitting near his bread plate. He was a man who spent decades avoiding conflict, and he was currently praying the impending collision would somehow bypass him. Aunt Helen and Uncle David watched me with a mixture of apprehension and manufactured pity. Diane had clearly spent the previous hour setting the stage, feeding them the narrative of the destitute parents and the heartless, wealthy offspring. Their faces reflected the righteous indignation of people who believe they are participating in a moral intervention. I walked across the patterned carpet. The sound of my heels was muted by the thick padding underneath, but the steady rhythm of my approach drew every eye at the table. I did not rush. I maintained a measured, deliberate pace. I was not the terrified teenager they remembered. I was the architect of my own environment. I reached the empty chair waiting for me. The polite conversation halted. The orchestrated silence felt heavy, layered with expectation and predatory intent. Diane's coral smile widened, stretching tight across her teeth. She looked at me not as a daughter she missed, but as an automated teller machine materializing in the flesh. She saw the charcoal suit and the sleek leather folder, and her eyes performed a rapid calculation of the potential payout. She looked at me the way a starving predator looks at an easy mark. She thought the presence of the extended family had secured her victory before a single word was spoken. Before speaking, I let the silence stretch. I placed my hands on top of the black leather folder, grounding myself in the physical texture of the grain. I surveyed the faces staring back at me. Aunt Helen adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes darting between Diane and me, hungry for the drama she had been promised. Uncle David cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to convey paternal authority. They were eager participants in a shakedown, convinced they held the moral high ground. They represented the very concept of blood obligation that Diane was trying to exploit. I thought about the concept of family as I sat there. True kinship is proven through action, through presence, and through mutual respect. The people sitting at this round table shared my genetic code, but they were strangers to my reality. Julian was my family. The network of colleagues and clients who respected my boundaries and valued my contributions were my family. The individuals sitting across the linen tablecloth were simply creditors attempting to collect a debt I never signed for. The waiter approached, holding a silver pitcher of ice water. He filled my glass with practiced efficiency, breaking the tension for a fleeting second before vanishing back into the shadows of the dining room. The condensation formed immediately on the outside of the crystal goblet. They all smiled a collective, unsettling display of teeth. They were entirely unaware that the dynamic in the room was inverted. Diane thought she had lured a naive, compliant artist into a carefully constructed trap. She believed the pressure of the country club and the audience of elders would force a rapid surrender. She had no idea the prey was carrying the blueprints to her destruction, neatly filed inside a black leather casing. Diane leaned forward, her posture shifting from anxious anticipation to rehearsed warmth. The curtain was rising on her performance. She took a breath, preparing to launch the opening monologue of her extortion attempt. She assumed she controlled the pacing of this narrative. I took a slow sip of the ice water, letting the cold liquid sharpen my focus. I was ready to let her speak, knowing her words were about to collide with a wall of undeniable evidence. The trap was indeed set, but the jaws were facing the wrong direction. I settled into the plush, upholstered chair across from my parents. The unmarked leather folder rested flush against the pristine tablecloth directly in front of my hands. A heavy silence descended over our corner of the dining room, thick with unstated demands and suffocating expectations. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie with nervous, jerky movements. He assumed the role of the reluctant patriarch, a character he rarely played, but summoned whenever Diane required a human shield. He began his monologue utilizing a practiced, measured cadence. According to his revised script, the Woods clan was a fiercely loyal unit. He spoke of enduring bonds, shared history, and the absolute moral imperative to support one another during unforeseen challenges. Listening to him preach about loyalty was a profoundly surreal experience. This was the identical man who stared blindly at utility bills while my college tuition was stolen from under me. Now he suddenly discovered the virtue of parental responsibility because his preferred offspring required a massive financial parachute. Richard then pivoted to the core fabrication. He adjusted his posture, attempting to project unwavering confidence to the surrounding audience. He explained that his son-in-law was navigating a highly complex, incredibly lucrative phase of commercial property acquisition. He deployed corporate jargon, tossing around terms like market fluctuation, strategic leveraging, and asset accumulation. The current crisis, Richard assured everyone at the round table, was merely a temporary cash flow issue. It was a brief liquidity squeeze caused by aggressive, visionary expansion. The sheer magnitude of that lie echoed in my ears, ringing hollow against the crystal glassware. I kept my facial expression entirely neutral, but my fingers brushed the textured edge of the black casing. The dramatic irony was almost unbearable. Richard boasted about a thriving real estate empire, utterly oblivious to the reality that I held Bradley's federal bankruptcy filing mere inches from his water goblet. The documents concealed inside my folder proved the temporary squeeze was actually a catastrophic collapse born from federal fraud. Aunt Helen nodded along with Richard's explanation, her features displaying deep, manufactured sympathy. Uncle David offered a solemn grunt of approval, completely purchasing the fraudulent narrative. They genuinely believed they were participating in a noble rescue mission to aid a brilliant businessman weathering a tough economic quarter. Their presence was designed to act as a moral vice, crushing any resistance I might offer. Once Richard established the illusion of temporary misfortune, Olivia initiated the second phase of their synchronized offensive. She leaned forward, placing her elbows on the linen cloth. The golden child was stripped of her usual arrogant armor. Her lower lip trembled with practiced precision. It was a calculated display of vulnerability engineered to bypass my logical defenses and strike directly at sibling compassion. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. A single glistening tear escaped her lash line, rolling slowly down her cheek, cutting a visible path through her thick layer of designer concealer. She whispered that she never wanted to burden my new life. She claimed she tried to shield me from their escalating struggles, insisting she carried the crushing weight alone out of sheer noble pride. "We are going to lose everything, Ella," she choked out, her voice breaking perfectly on the final syllable. "The house, the business, our entire future. We are standing on the edge of a cliff and there is no safety net left." It was a phenomenal theatrical performance. If I were still the isolated teenager desperate for a shred of familial connection, that solitary tear might have shattered my resolve. I might have reached across the table, grabbed her manicured hand, and promised to fix her disintegrating reality. But I was no longer that ghost haunting the hallways of their suburban home. I studied her crying face with the detached precision of a digital designer analyzing a corrupted image file. I saw the manipulation woven into every sob, every rehearsed quiver of her chin. She was mourning the impending loss of her expensive handbags, her luxury vacations, and her unearned social status, not the deterioration of our sisterhood. Her grief was entirely centered on the evaporation of her vanity. The assembled audience, however, was entirely captivated by the display. Helen reached over and patted Olivia's heaving shoulder, casting a sorrowful look in my direction. David shot me a stern, expectant glare, silently demanding I rectify the tragedy unfolding before him. The trap was fully deployed. They had painted a masterpiece of victimhood, framing me as the sole savior capable of averting total ruin. Sensing the emotional climate was perfectly calibrated, Diane moved in for the final lethal blow. The matriarch abandoned her nervous finger-tapping. She straightened her spine, projecting absolute righteous maternal authority. She did not whisper. She intentionally elevated her vocal register, ensuring the decibel level carried far beyond our immediate circle. She wanted the neighboring wealthy patrons, the hovering waitstaff, and the judging relatives to catch every single syllable of her decree. "We know you would not let your own sister end up on the street," Diane declared, her tone sharp, ringing, and laced with venomous entitlement. "Not when you are sitting on billions of dollars. Your husband has so much capital, Ella. 300,000 is practically a rounding error for Julian Sterling. We are asking you to do the right thing and honor your family when we need you the most." The air in the room thickened into a suffocating atmospheric pressure. The surrounding tables fell completely silent. The ambient clatter of silver-striking porcelain abruptly ceased. Dozens of unseen eyes shifted toward our corner, drawn by the undeniable friction of Diane's public aggressive demand. This was the absolute pinnacle of her extortion strategy. Diane engineered a scenario where a refusal would brand me a heartless monster in front of high society witnesses. The social mechanics of the country club dictated that I must submit to preserve polite decorum. She expected me to wilt under the crushing collective weight of public scrutiny. She anticipated a frantic surrender, a rushed promise to wire the funds, just to stop the mortifying spectacle. Alternatively, she expected me to scream, to throw a defensive tantrum, thereby proving to Aunt Helen and Uncle David that I was truly a bitter, unhinged villain who abandoned her loving kin. She handed me a script with only two possible endings: submission or public disgrace. They all waited. Olivia dabbed her eyes with a cloth napkin. Richard held his breath, bracing for impact. Diane beamed with predatory, triumphant confidence, convinced the check was already signed. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back into my upholstered chair. I did not reach for my wallet to fund their delusions. I slowly reached for the crystal goblet resting near my right hand. The condensation made the glass slick, but my grip remained incredibly firm. I lifted the rim to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the sparkling water. The carbonation popped softly against my tongue, a tiny, sharp sensation grounding me in the present moment. I swallowed, set the goblet back onto the table without making a sound, and folded my hands neatly on top of the black casing holding their destruction. I shifted my gaze directly to Diane. I locked onto her pupils. The eye contact I maintained was unyielding, devoid of any warmth, hesitation, or fear. It was a terrifying, absolute stare, mirroring the exact stoic posture of the digital zodiac buffalo I had rendered months ago. I did not blink. I let the silence stretch, expanding until her confident smile began to waver, her brain struggling to comprehend my terrifying lack of compliance. When the tension reached an agonizing breaking point, I leaned forward by a fraction of an inch. My voice was calm, pitched barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the heavy atmosphere like a surgical scalpel. "Why did you not come to my wedding, Mom?" The question hung in the chilled, climate-controlled air of the dining room. "Why did you not come to my wedding, Mom?" The ambient noise of the Oakmont Valley Country Club seemed to recede into a distant, muffled hum. The clinking of sterling silver against fine china from neighboring tables faded. The orchestrated heavy silence that followed my inquiry felt dense enough to crack the crystal water goblets resting in front of us. Diane's confident, coral-painted smile froze. The edges of her lips twitched, struggling desperately to maintain their upward trajectory. She had arrived at this table anticipating a high-stakes negotiation regarding a $300,000 wire transfer. She expected a tearful reconciliation or a defensive debate over repayment schedules. She was entirely unequipped to face a sudden clinical interrogation regarding her absence at my altar. Her eyes darted left and right, scanning the faces of the surrounding relatives. She needed to recalibrate her script. The tragic victim narrative she had spent weeks cultivating was suddenly interrupted by a glaring spotlight illuminating her own profound negligence. She blinked, and the pristine social mask she wore began to fracture. "Well, Ella," she stammered, her voice dropping its theatrical projection and adopting a defensive, hurried cadence. "You know, we had Olivia's trip planned. The deposits were non-refundable. It was unavoidable. We could not simply cancel a luxury excursion at the 11th hour." Unavoidable. The word slipped from her mouth like a rehearsed reflex. She clung to the Miami yacht vacation as if it were a vital diplomatic mission mandated by federal law rather than a leisure cruise. Aunt Helen frowned, shifting uncomfortably in her upholstered chair. The proxy soldier was beginning to sense a severe discrepancy in the battle plan. Diane had assured the extended relatives that my ceremony was a hastily arranged, spiteful affair designed specifically to steal attention. But my question, delivered with chilling serenity, did not sound like the irrational plea of a jealous sibling. It sounded like an indictment. I did not nod. I did not accept her hollow justification. I broke eye contact and directed my attention to the black leather folder resting beneath my folded hands. I peeled back the sleek cover. The crisp scent of fresh printer ink mingled with the ambient aroma of roasted garlic and expensive perfume hovering over our table. The interior of the casing held my curated artifacts. I did not rush the process. I wanted every person sitting at the round table to feel the agonizing weight of the impending revelation. I wanted Diane to watch her carefully constructed fortress begin to crumble brick by brick, unable to stop the demolition. I reached inside and pinched the top corner of the first document. I extracted a heavy piece of glossy photo paper. I placed my fingertips on the edges and slid the photograph across the white linen tablecloth. The glossy surface glided smoothly over the woven fabric, coming to a halt directly in the center of the table, equidistant from Diane Richard and Olivia. The image was a high-resolution, blown-up screenshot of the social media post Diane had uploaded the morning of my ceremony. The composition featured Olivia lounging on the teak deck of the rented Miami vessel, gripping her champagne flute, shielded by oversized designer sunglasses. The caption, "Family First," was printed clearly at the bottom of the frame. But the focal point of this artifact was not the image itself. I had utilized a red digital marker to circle the timestamp located in the upper left corner of the screenshot. Diane looked down at the photograph, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She could not comprehend why I was returning her own vacation evidence to her. "Look at the timestamp, Mom," I instructed, keeping my vocal register low and perfectly steady. Uncle David leaned forward, squinting through his reading glasses to inspect the red circle. Helen leaned in beside him, her curiosity overriding her allegiance. "That post went live at 11:15 in the morning," I stated, ensuring the acoustics of the room carried my syllables directly to the ears of the extended relatives. That was the exact hour I was standing in the center of the conservatory. That was the precise minute the officiant asked for the rings. I was walking down the aisle, and you were uploading a picture of a boat rental to prove to your country club friends that you were having a better time. Diane opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another hollow excuse regarding non-refundable deposits, but I did not afford her the opportunity. The first document merely established her cruelty. The second document would establish her ruin. I reached back into the leather folder. I extracted a thick stack of legal paperwork stapled meticulously at the top left corner. This was the copy of the property deed and the corresponding home equity line of credit default notice. I slid the dense stack of papers across the tablecloth, aligning it perfectly parallel to the yacht photograph. Richard recognized the bank letterhead immediately. The color drained from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin a pale ashen gray. He shrunk back into his chair, attempting to merge with the upholstery. He recognized the exact financial instrument that had sealed his impending doom. Diane stared at the dense paragraphs of banking terminology. Her eyes darted across the page, landing on the bold text declaring, "The account in arrears." Then her gaze drifted to the bottom of the page, resting on the origination signatures. She saw the looping, hurried cursive forming her own name. She saw the distinct, gaudy, metallic gold ink she had utilized to mortgage her shelter. The realization of what I held in my possession hit her with the physical force of a tidal wave. She was not merely facing a daughter she had wronged. She was facing an adversary holding the blueprints to her federal and financial destruction. I kept my hands resting on the edge of the table. I did not gloat. I delivered the truth with the detached precision of a surgeon operating on a corrupted organ. "You didn't miss my wedding because of a trip," I said calmly, ensuring the aunt heard every syllable. Aunt Helen inhaled a sharp, audible breath. Uncle David froze his gaze, darting between the yacht photograph and the foreclosure notice, his mind struggling to process the staggering debt displayed on the paper. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between my mother and me. "You missed it. To set fire to your own house to fund a fraudulent scheme so Olivia could pretend she wasn't broke." I paused, letting the devastating reality of the federal investigation settle over the crystal glassware. "And now," I concluded, dropping my voice to a chilling whisper, "you want me to buy the ashes." Olivia turned pale. The carefully manufactured tear she had produced moments ago dried instantly upon her cheek. Her performative vulnerability evaporated, replaced by genuine, suffocating panic. The designer veneer she spent her entire adulthood maintaining shattered into jagged, irreparable fragments right in front of the extended family she sought to impress. She looked like a ghost who suddenly realized she was transparent. Her manicured hands trembled so severely she had to pull them off the table and hide them in her lap, terrified by the exposure of Bradley's criminal insolvency. My father stared at his hands. He did not offer a defense. He did not attempt to shield his wife or his favorite daughter. He simply lowered his head and studied his own cuticles with intense, cowardly dedication. He was a man who had spent 3 decades taking the path of least resistance, and he had finally reached the dead end. There was no more equity to drain. There were no more lies to hide behind. The bank was coming for his home, and his overlooked daughter was delivering the eviction notice. Aunt Helen looked at the metallic gold signature on the banking document. She looked at the timestamp on the photograph. The proxy soldier realized she had been drafted into a war based on a catastrophic fabrication. Diane Helen whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of betrayal and profound embarrassment. "What is this? What scheme is she talking about?" Diane could not answer her sister. Her vocal cords were paralyzed. The matriarch who prided herself on controlling every narrative, every room, and every family dynamic was reduced to a silent, hyperventilating shell. She stared at the golden ink of her own signature as if it were a venomous serpent uncoiling on the white linen. The extortion attempt was officially dead, suffocated under the weight of documented truth. But the quiet execution was not yet complete. I had one final artifact remaining inside the black leather casing, and I was preparing to pin it to the table with a block of solid gold. The exposure of a lifelong manipulator rarely results in quiet acceptance. When the structural integrity of their alternate reality collapses, they do not apologize. They attack. Diane stared at the foreclosure notice and the time-stamped photograph resting on the white linen. The undeniable proof of her federal and financial ruin sat under the harsh, unblinking glare of the dining room chandeliers. She realized her sister Helen and her brother-in-law David were studying those same documents, processing the staggering depth of her deception. The curated image of the wealthy, flawless matriarch evaporated, leaving behind a desperate woman caught orchestrating a shakedown. A mottled, uneven flush of crimson crept up her neck, staining her collarbone and spreading to her cheeks. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the round table so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. She could not refute the banking records. She could not alter the digital timestamp. Therefore, she fell back on the only defensive strategy remaining in her arsenal. She attempted to turn my execution into an act of unprovoked cruelty. "You are vindictive," she hissed, her vocal cords tightening. She abandoned the hushed, polite register required by the Oakmont Valley Country Club. Her voice pitched upward, sharp and erratic, cutting through the refined ambient noise of the surrounding patrons. "You came here specifically to humiliate us," she continued, her breathing turning ragged and shallow. "You sat on this information, knowing your sister was suffering, knowing we were in jeopardy, just so you could parade your new wealth in our faces. You are a cruel, heartless girl. You married a billionaire, and it turned you into a monster." Several heads turned at neighboring tables. A waiter holding a tray of champagne flutes paused mid-stride, his eyes darting toward our corner. Diane was actively violating the fundamental rule of her own sanctuary, sacrificing her social decorum in a blind panic to regain the upper hand. She wanted the audience to view me as a wealthy tyrant torturing a desperate family. I did not flinch. My heart rate remained a slow, steady rhythm. The temperature of my skin did not rise. When an opponent abandons their logic and resorts to emotional theatrics, you do not meet them at their decibel level. You let their frantic energy burn out in the cold vacuum of your silence. I waited for her to finish her accusation. I watched her chest heave beneath her navy blue church dress. "I am not the one who leveraged a family home to fund a Ponzi scheme," I replied, my tone flat and devoid of any defensive inflection. "I am just the person holding the receipts." I reached into the black leather folder one final time. There was a single artifact remaining inside the casing. It was the keystone of the entire architectural structure I had built for this afternoon. I pulled out the physical RSVP card. The thick cotton cardstock felt substantial between my fingers. The deep emerald-painted edges caught the overhead light. I did not place it right side up. I laid it face down on the tablecloth, positioning it directly over the bank foreclosure notice. The contrasting visual was striking. The sterile, printed legal jargon of the eviction warning was now partially covered by Diane's own looping, hurried cursive. The ink she had used to write her rejection was the exact same gaudy metallic gold she had used to mortgage her shelter. Diane looked at the back of the RSVP card. Her jaw slackened. The righteous fury she had attempted to summon just seconds prior drained away, replaced by a hollow, sickening recognition. She remembered writing that note. She remembered sealing the envelope and dropping it into the mail, confident that my life was a trivial footnote she could easily dismiss. I reached into my structured handbag resting on the floor beside my chair. My fingers closed around the cold, smooth metal of the physical gold bar Julian had cast for me. The object was astonishingly heavy, a dense block of pure, unattached value. I lifted it from the bag. The ambient light of the dining room struck the polished surface, throwing a warm, radiant glow across the pristine white linen. The gold was flawless, demanding attention, not through volume, but through sheer, undeniable presence. I brought the heavy metal down onto the center of the table. I used it to pin the RSVP card flat against the tablecloth. The dull, authoritative thud of the solid gold striking the wood beneath the linen echoed through our immediate circle. The sound possessed a finality that made Richard jump in his seat. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look at the display of wealth she had spent her life chasing, now being utilized to anchor her own demise. I kept my hand resting on the cool surface of the paperweight. I channeled the exact energy I had poured into the digital Zodiac Buffalo months ago. I adopted a heavy, stoic, unyielding posture. I aligned my spine, squared my shoulders, and locked my gaze onto Diane's panicked eyes. I left zero margin for error in my presentation. I read her handwritten note aloud, pacing my syllables with deliberate, surgical precision. Ella, you know Olivia's yacht trip is that weekend. It is a bit of a joke that you did not check with us first. I paused, letting the word joke hang suspended in the chilled air. I watched Aunt Helen's expression curdle in real time. The proxy soldier was listening to the undeniable proof of Diane's malice. Helen had been told that I scheduled my wedding out of spite. She was now looking at physical evidence proving Diane had mocked my invitation to attend a fraudulent boat party. I leaned forward, closing the remaining distance across the round table. The metallic gold ink shimmered beneath the heavy block of actual gold. "You called my life a joke," I said. My voice was a quiet, devastating current. I did not break eye contact. Diane stared back at me, her coral lips parted, her breathing entirely suspended. "You do not get to ask the punchline for a $300,000 bailout." The execution was complete. The ledger was closed. There was nothing left to negotiate. There were no more documents to present, no more lies to unravel. I had stripped away the visual and emotional clutter of the Woods family hierarchy, leaving them with the suffocating reality of their own choices. I pulled my hand away from the paperweight. I left the gold bar sitting on the table, pinning the evidence of their cruelty to the evidence of their ruin. It was a parting gift, a structural monument to the boundary I had just permanently erected. I pushed my upholstered chair back and stood up. The movement broke the trance that had paralyzed the surrounding relatives. Aunt Helen stood up simultaneously. The pearls around her neck rattled against her collarbone. She did not look at me. Her gaze was locked entirely on her sister. The horror written across Helen's face was profound. She had been weaponized, manipulated into attacking her niece on behalf of a woman who was simultaneously committing federal fraud and discarding her own child. The social contract between the sisters was fracturing beyond repair. Helen leaned over the table, bracing her hands on the linen cloth. "You lied to all of us," Helen stated. Her voice trembled, thick with disgust and betrayal. "You sat in my living room and cried about her selfishness while you were sinking your own ship and ignoring her wedding." Diane reached out a trembling hand toward her sister. "Helen, please, you do not understand the pressure we were under. Bradley promised us the returns were guaranteed. We were just trying to survive." Helen recoiled, pulling her hands off the table as if the tablecloth itself were infected. "Do not speak to me," Helen snapped, her Midwestern politeness evaporating into pure disdain. "You dragged our family into your pathetic charade. You are on your own, Diane." Uncle David stood up next, tossing his cloth napkin onto his untouched bread plate. He did not offer a farewell. He simply turned his back on Richard and began walking toward the coat check, leaving the patriarch to sit alone in his cowardly silence. I did not wait to watch the rest of the fallout. The collapse of their inner circle was their burden to navigate, not mine. I picked up my structured handbag and turned away from the round table. The path to the arched mahogany doors was clear, the neighboring patrons, having witnessed the quiet, devastating implosion of the group in the corner, averted their eyes as I passed. I walked with a steady, measured cadence. My posture remained flawless. The sharp, rhythmic sound of my heels struck the polished marble foyer, echoing through the expansive architecture of the country club. Every step carried me further away from the ghosts of Pennsylvania. I was leaving the hand-me-down electronics, the $50 gift cards, and the empty reserved chairs behind me. I was walking back toward the cinematic light, toward perfect harmony, and toward a life built on pure, unattached value. I stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of the Oakmont Valley Country Club and into the crisp afternoon air. The valet brought my car around and handed me the keys with a polite nod. I slid into the driver's seat. The leather felt cool against my back. I pressed the ignition and listened to the quiet hum of the engine waking up. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the manicured lawns. I glanced in the rearview mirror one final time. The grand colonial architecture of the clubhouse shrank in the reflection until it disappeared behind a row of ancient oak trees. The drive back to my home felt fundamentally different from the journey there. I drove with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel while watching the Pennsylvania landscape blur past the windows. For 28 years, I carried a dense, suffocating weight inside my chest. It was the physical manifestation of waiting for a nod of approval, waiting for a $50 gift card to magically transform into genuine affection, waiting for the people who shared my last name to remember I existed in the same room. That wait was gone. It did not fade gradually. It vanished the second I left that solid gold paperweight sitting on the white linen tablecloth. I inhaled a deep breath of the air conditioning and savored the profound, unburdened freedom filling the cabin. I was no longer a ghost haunting the corners of someone else's stage. I was the author of my own reality. The collapse of my family-curated illusion occurred with astonishing speed. The documents I left pinned to the table acted as the catalyst. Aunt Helen did not keep the revelations quiet. She returned to her social circles in Ohio and systematically dismantled my mother-fabricated victim narrative. Helen recounted every detail of the foreclosure notice. She described the time-stamped yacht photograph and the cruel note scrawled on the back of my RSVP card. She distributed the truth with the efficiency of a seasoned prosecutor. Within weeks, the gossip network that Diane spent her life cultivating turned against her. The women at the country club stopped returning her calls. The charity boards quietly requested her resignation. Her social standing evaporated into thin air. I did not have to raise my voice to destroy her reputation. I simply provided the raw data and allowed the truth to execute its own judgment. The federal authorities moved on Bradley firm before the end of the month. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze every asset connected to his fraudulent holding company. The bankruptcy proceedings transformed from a looming threat into a brutal public spectacle. The luxury vehicles were repossessed from their driveway. The designer handbags Olivia wielded like weapons were either sold to cover legal fees or seized by creditors. The glossy veneer she wore to mask her insecurities dissolved. She was left facing the consequences of her own boundless vanity. The bank executed the foreclosure on the colonial house with clinical efficiency. The property was listed at auction. The deep equity was drained to zero. Richard and Diane were forced to vacate the premises. They packed their remaining possessions into rented boxes and relocated to a small two-bedroom condominium on the outskirts of the county. The sprawling suburban fortress where they cultivated their golden child and banished me to the shadows belonged to a stranger now. I did not intervene. I did not send a check to soften their fall. I let the consequences of their greed run their natural course. I returned to the architectural sanctuary I shared with Julian. The contrast between the chaos consuming Pennsylvania and the quiet stability of our home was striking. I walked into my sunlit studio. The expansive windows offered a panoramic view of the river cutting through the landscape. Julian was sitting on the leather sofa, reviewing a quarterly projection on his tablet. He looked up when I entered, and his eyes searched my face for any lingering traces of the encounter. He saw the serene, unbroken calm settling over my features. He set the tablet down and offered a slow, knowing smile. The ledger was balanced. I channeled that newfound freedom directly into my career. I stopped working as an isolated freelancer navigating anonymous contracts. I drafted a business plan. I secured a commercial lease in a creative district and launched my own digital design firm. I named the agency Lumina. I built my company on the exact principles I utilized to survive my childhood. I hired talented artists who understood the necessity of structural integrity. We focused our portfolio on vibrant aesthetics. We demanded rich cinematic palettes and flawless geometry. I instituted a strict creative policy banning pitch-black backgrounds from our primary branding. We engineered digital environments that possessed depth and warmth and perfect breathable harmony. Every canvas we delivered required meticulous pruning. We removed excess visual noise until only the essential truth remained. The agency flourished. Clients gravitated toward our unyielding demand for precision. I stood in the center of a thriving creative hub, directing campaigns for international brands. I operated with the quiet authority I discovered on my wedding day. I want to take this moment to address you directly. We spend so much of our lives conditioned to believe that blood dictates obligation. We are taught to endure disrespect and swallow our milestones. We are told to shrink our presence just to keep the peace at a holiday dinner table. We accept the crumbs of attention from people who demand the entirety of our grace. Family is not defined by shared DNA. Family is a verb. It is the act of showing up. It is the people who sit in the front row of your life. It is not the ones who leave their reserved chairs empty for a boat rental. The people who truly matter will never ask you to dim your light so they can shine brighter. They will hand you the tools to build a bigger stage. Setting boundaries with toxic relatives is often framed as a cruel or selfish act. It is neither. A boundary is not a punishment you inflict on someone else. It is the removal of life visual clutter. It is the process of pruning away the dry branches and the draining relationships and the manufactured drama to ensure your own environment achieves harmony. You have the fundamental right to curate the energy you allow into your space. I want you to think about that emerald-edged RSVP card sitting under the block of solid gold. What would you have done if you received that piece of mail? Would you have crumbled under the weight of the rejection? Would you have written a furious email demanding an apology? Or would you have filed it away, using their own words as the blueprint for your liberation? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single response, and I want to know how you would handle that exact moment. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen, if it gave you the blueprint to draw your own line in the sand, hit the subscribe button. We are building a community of people who refuse to be treated as an afterthought. I turn away from the camera and look across the studio. Julian is standing near the drafting table, inspecting a new cosmic rendering I completed that morning. The sunlight catches the clean lines of his profile. He does not need me to shrink. He does not demand the center of the frame. He simply stands beside me. He is an anchor of pure, unattached value. I look at the life I designed. The shadows are gone. The lighting is perfect. I realize that sometimes the greatest gift toxic people can give you is their absence. When they finally stay away, they leave you with a blank canvas, ready to be filled with exactly what you deserve.